Picture the House floor on the evening of February 11th, 2026. The chamber is loud. Democrats are on their feet. There's actual cheering, not the polished, camera-ready applause you see at the State of the Union, but raw, genuine cheering, the kind that breaks out when something happens that nobody was sure was actually going to happen. And across the aisle, the Republican side is conspicuously quiet. Heads down, phones out. Some members look like they're calculating exactly what this means for them personally. Then the final tally appears on the board, 219 to 211. And in that moment, something unusual just happened in the United States Congress. The House of Representatives voted to revoke President Donald Trump's tariffs on Canada. Bipartisan, on the record, right to his face. 6 Republicans crossed the aisle and handed him one of the most pointed rebukes of his second term on a policy he has called the cornerstone of his America First agenda. And Trump's response? He fired back within the hour, publicly threatening those members with primary challenges, posting on Truth Social while the votes were literally still being counted. Before we're done today, I'm going to take you through everything. How we got here, why this vote is both more and less significant than it appears, what it tells us about the slow fracturing of Republican unity, and what comes next in a fight that is far from over. Let's start with the foundation, because none of this makes sense without it. Back in February of 2025, Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing sweeping tariffs on Canada, invoking a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. The official justification was a national emergency tied to fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, 10% on energy and potash. That was the opening move. Then the escalation came. By August of 2025, those tariffs had climbed to 35%. At various points, Trump threatened 50%, threatened 100%, threatened to shut down a bridge between Windsor and Detroit. He terminated trade talks entirely in October. The relationship between two of the closest trading partners in the world, countries that buy more from each other than almost any bilateral pair on the planet, became a running, escalating economic confrontation. Here's why that matters so much. In 2024, Canada was the top destination for American goods exports, $350 billion worth, and it sent $412 billion in imports into the United States, making it the third largest source of goods the American economy depends on. Canada is not some peripheral trading partner. It is deeply woven into the fabric of American manufacturing, American agriculture, and American energy. Canada supplies 63% of US crude oil imports. 1.5 million American jobs depend directly on Canadian exports. When you put a 35% tariff wall between the United States and a partner this integrated, you are not making a clean, surgical economic adjustment. You are yanking a thread that runs through the entire sweater. And Americans started feeling it. Fertilizer prices up. Equipment prices up. Agricultural producers in Nebraska, Washington, Colorado, and Pennsylvania watching their input costs climb while their Canadian buyers faced retaliatory tariffs that made American products more expensive on the other side of the border. A small business owner in Colorado getting hit with an unexpected $20,000 tariff bill on goods she'd been importing for years without incident. The Congressional Budget Office, which does not editorialize, released projections showing inflation from 2026 through 2029 will run higher than previously forecast, and tariffs are the primary driver of that revision. Now, here's where the legal architecture gets important, because this is the crack that the House vote slipped through. IEEPA is not a tariff law. Congress passed it in 1977 specifically to give presidents tools to respond to emergencies through asset freezes, sanctions, and trade restrictions. But it does not use the word tariff. It authorizes the president to regulate importation during a declared emergency. And no president in the 48 years between 1977 and 2025 ever read that language as permission to unilaterally set tariff rates. Trump did. And two lower federal courts, the Court of International Trade and the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, both ruled that he exceeded his authority. Those decisions are now before the United States Supreme Court, which heard oral arguments in November 2025 and has yet to rule. Legal analysts watching the oral arguments say a majority of justices appeared skeptical of the administration's position, though the exact grounds for any ruling remain unclear. A decision is expected sometime in early to mid-2026. If the Supreme Court sides with the lower courts, the entire legal scaffolding holding up these tariffs collapses overnight. But here's the other legal angle, and it's the one that made Wednesday's vote possible at all. Because Trump used IEEPA, which is a national emergency law, to impose these tariffs, Congress has a specific procedural lever available to it. The law includes a provision allowing Congress to terminate a declared national emergency through a joint resolution that bypasses the filibuster and moves on a simple majority. Democrats have been trying to use that lever for months. The ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, introduced a resolution last spring to do exactly that. Speaker Mike Johnson blocked it. He passed a rule at the beginning of the year that prevented such resolutions from coming to the House floor through July. And that's where things stood, until 3 Republicans blew the door open. On Tuesday, February 10th, the night before the big vote, Johnson tried to extend that blocking rule through the end of July. And 3 Republicans, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Kevin Kiley of California, and Don Bacon of Nebraska, voted with every single Democrat to kill it. That was the procedural lever. That was the moment that made everything else possible. Massie framed it in constitutional terms. Taxing authority, he said, belongs to Congress, not the executive branch. The Constitution requires it. Bacon, who is retiring at the end of this term and therefore has significantly less to fear from presidential retaliation, said it plainly. Congress needs to be able to debate tariffs. Once that rule failed, the Meeks resolution could come to the floor, and the next night it did. The 6 Republicans who ultimately voted yes were Massie, Bacon, and Kiley, who had already shown their hand the night before, plus Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, Jeff Hurd of Colorado, and Dan Newhouse of Washington State. These are not random names. Think about the geography. Fitzpatrick and Hurd represent competitive swing districts where tariff-driven price increases have been politically toxic and where Democrats are already circling for the 2026 midterms. Newhouse's district in Washington State has an economy that, in his own words, is heavily intertwined with Canada's. Agricultural producers facing higher input costs, a beer and wine and spirits industry hit by Canadian retaliatory measures. Hurd told reporters he looked at the Constitution, looked at what was best for his district, and cast his vote. He acknowledged it wasn't easy. He said he stands by it, and when asked about Trump's threatened retribution, he gave an answer that said everything. I do the right thing, and what the consequences are, we'll have to see. Bacon went further. He told CNN that in his assessment, as many as 30 Republican members privately agree with him. But most of them couldn't bring themselves to vote that way because, again, his words, they feel like they're between a rock and a hard place. They don't want to get on the bad side of the president. He said Trump needs to understand that Congress is not a rubber stamp. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. A sitting member of the president's own party in the United States House of Representatives felt it necessary to say out loud that Congress is not a rubber stamp. That tells you something about the baseline dynamic that has developed over the course of this second term. Now let's talk about Trump's response, because the speed and tone of it were revealing. Speaker Johnson had just left the White House. He stood in front of cameras and told reporters that Trump was not upset, that he understood what was going on, that the veto power made this irrelevant anyway. Johnson called the vote a fruitless exercise and a pointless one. He said he was disappointed, but that policy wouldn't change. Classic damage control language, the kind designed to tamp down the story, minimize the optics, and move on. Then Trump opened Truth Social. Within the hour of the House vote wrapping up, he posted, "Any Republican in the House or the Senate who votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries." He added that tariffs have given the country economic and national security, and that no Republican should be responsible for destroying that privilege. Let's be precise about what that is. That is the sitting President of the United States, in real time, threatening members of his own party with political destruction for exercising their constitutional authority to vote on trade policy. Not threatening Democrats, his own people. The people he needs to pass his agenda, the people who have voted with him on virtually everything else. And here is the part that matters most about that threat. Some of it may land, and some of it already can't. Bacon is retiring. Newhouse has said he's not seeking re-election. Trump is already backing a primary challenger against Massey. Kylie's district was redrawn by California Democrats, and his own electoral future is uncertain regardless. That leaves Fitzpatrick and Hurd, both in competitive swing districts, both well-liked in their communities, both calculating that the economic reality in their districts gives them cover. Whether that calculation holds through a primary season where MAGA energy runs hot is a genuinely open question. But step back for a moment and look at the bigger constitutional picture, because there's something deeper happening here than a tariff dispute. The law Trump used to impose these tariffs, IEEPA, was written specifically because Congress decided in 1977 that Richard Nixon had accumulated too much unchecked executive power. It was a check, a deliberate, legislatively crafted check on what Congress saw as an overreach. Now, that very check is being deployed by Congress against a president who took that same law and stretched it in a direction no previous president had ever attempted. The Court of International Trade said it plainly. Regulate importation does not mean unlimited authority to tax imports at whatever rate the president decides, for as long as he decides, on whatever national security rationale he constructs. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and to levy tariffs. That is not a technicality. That is the foundational architecture of American trade law. For decades, Congress has voluntarily delegated chunks of that authority to the executive branch through various statutes. Presidents of both parties have used that delegation. But IEEPA, built for sanctions and asset freezes, was never meant to be a blank tariff check, and both lower federal courts said so unanimously. What Wednesday's vote represents, at its core, is a small group of Republican lawmakers saying, "We want that authority back," not because they necessarily oppose tariffs on principle, but because they believe the institution of Congress has ceded so much ground that it is becoming functionally irrelevant to trade policy. And they watch the Supreme Court quietly preparing to possibly do what Congress couldn't: strike down the legal basis for the tariffs entirely. So where does this go now? The Meeks resolution heads to the Senate. Because it holds privileged status under IEEPA's own procedures, it cannot be filibustered. It only needs a simple majority. The Senate has already passed similar resolutions. Last April, it voted 51 to 48 to revoke the Canada Emergency Declaration, with Susan Collins of Maine, Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul of Kentucky, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska all joining the Democratic caucus. If that same coalition holds, the resolution passes the Senate and lands on Trump's desk, where he will veto it. Nobody seriously disputes that. Johnson said it himself. The votes to override a veto, which would require 2/3 majorities in both chambers, simply do not exist. When the House voted on tariff-related veto overrides earlier in this term, large numbers of Republicans who had originally voted for the underlying bills flipped when the override came up, unwilling to take that final definitive step. The system, as designed, protects executive power at the veto stage in ways that it doesn't at the initial vote. So is this purely symbolic? Not entirely. Here's what it actually does. It forces Republicans who privately hate these tariffs to go on record one way or another. It creates a paper trail of economic pain that Democrats can run against in November. It opens the procedural door to future votes. Kiley noted after Tuesday's procedural win that this same mechanism can now be used on Mexico tariffs, on the Liberation Day global tariffs, potentially on anything imposed under IEEPA. Democrats have effectively unlocked a recurring weapon. And it sends a signal to the markets, to trading partners, and to the Supreme Court about the breadth of congressional opposition to the president's trade architecture. Canada, for its part, has been watching all of this closely. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been working to reduce Canadian dependency on the American market. European exports up 22% in 2025 compared to 2024. African exports up 18%. Canada is diversifying, slowly, partially, but deliberately. The Royal Bank of Canada described the original tariff shock as the country's largest trade disruption in nearly 100 years, comparing it to the Smoot-Hawley era. And while the USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, is due for a mandatory review in July 2026, that negotiation is now happening against a backdrop of deep bilateral mistrust, ongoing tariffs, and a US president who has, at various points, suggested Canada should simply become the 51st state. There's also the Supreme Court hanging over everything. If the justices strike down IEEPA tariffs, even partially, the president's entire tariff architecture built on emergency declarations unravels. The Canada tariffs, the Mexico tariffs, the Liberation Day global tariffs, all of them resting on that same legal foundation. The administration has argued that striking them down would trigger economic consequences on the scale of a depression. The lower courts disagreed with that framing and ruled anyway. How the Supreme Court threads that needle, if indeed it rules against the administration, will define the limits of executive trade power for a generation. Here's what gets lost in the back and forth of any single vote. There are real people behind every one of these numbers. A farmer in Washington state watching fertilizer prices climb because the inputs flow across a border that now costs 35% more to cross. A steel manufacturer in Pennsylvania navigating a supply chain built over decades around the assumption that American and Canadian industry operated as partners, not adversaries. A small business owner in Colorado who can't tell her suppliers what her costs will be next month because that depends on what might get posted on Truth Social tonight. The Congressional Budget Office projects that 70% of import cost increases from tariffs get passed through to consumers in the form of higher prices. That's not a policy debate abstraction. That's your grocery bill. That's the price sticker on equipment. That's the slow, invisible tax that lands on people who weren't in the room when any of this was decided. And that is precisely why 6 Republicans decided that being in the room and voting mattered, even when the outcome was mathematically predetermined. Even when the president of their own party went online to threaten them before the night was over. The revolt is small. The barriers to actually changing policy are enormous. The veto is certain. The Supreme Court is unpredictable. The midterms are months away. And the president has shown repeatedly that he treats loyalty as the only currency that matters in politics, and that he will spend whatever political capital he has punishing those who spend theirs differently. But here is what's also true. The 6 Republicans who voted yes on February 11th chose their districts over their leadership. They chose constitutional principle over party discipline. They did the math on their own political survival and concluded that representing the people who sent them to Washington was worth the price. Don Bacon said it best. He needs to know we're not a rubber stamp. That sentence will echo in the caucus rooms and hallways of the Capitol long after the final vote tally on this particular resolution fades from the news cycle. Whether the wall holds, whether the coalition grows, whether the Supreme Court or the next election cycle, or the slow accumulation of economic pain finally tips the balance on tariff policy, none of that is settled. What is settled is that on the evening of February 11th, 2026, the House of Representatives looked at the president's signature economic policy and said, "We object," officially, on the record, with Republican votes. That matters, even if the veto arrives before the week is out. If you want to understand where this goes next, the Senate vote, the Supreme Court decision, the USMCA renegotiation, what a growing Republican fracture means for the rest of Trump's second term, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is moving fast, and we're going to be right here covering every development as it unfolds.